The distress signal wasn't human. It led me to an escape pod buried in crystalline sand on Kepler 442. Inside, a child with pointed ears handed me a pulsing pendant that would change everything. 15 years later, that same child stands before me as a galactic queen. Jake Morrison's world consisted of two colors, rust orange and warning flash yellow. His days were measured in cargo tonnage and dust storm alerts. His life a predictable loop of maintenance checks and questionable station coffee. Kepler Dortekirkike was just another mining rock in another forgotten system. The kind of place where the most exciting thing that happened was finding an extra protein pack in your ration kit. His current run was textbook routine. 53 metric tons of refined ore, destination Titan outpost, expected turbulence in Sector 7. The scanner display showed the usual debris fields and mineral deposits, the background noise of a planet that had been strip-mined for 3 decades. Nothing moved out here except the perpetual sandstorms that scraped against his hull like a giant grinding its teeth. It was then that a new frequency pattern bloomed on his peripheral display. It wasn't the standard triple beat of a human SOS. This was something else entirely. A complex harmony of overlapping tones that made his equipment throw up a syntax error. The screen flashed unidentified protocol in angry red letters. Regulation 14C was clear. Unverified signals get logged and ignored. His fuel reserves were already lower than he'd like, and the external sensors showed atmospheric pressure dropping fast. Another sandstorm was brewing on the horizon. A towering wall of orange particulate that would reduce visibility to 0. Smart Money said punch the coordinates and get clear. But the signal kept repeating. Every 12 seconds exactly, that same melodic chime cut through the static. It didn't sound automated. There was a cadence to it. A rising inflection at the end of each sequence that felt less like a recording and more like a question. He ran a diagnostic. The origin point was closer than he expected, maybe 3 kilometers off his plotted course. The scanner couldn't identify the source type through all the crystalline interference, but the coordinates placed it in a basin that wasn't on any mining survey. His instruments showed 0 energy readings, 0 heat signatures. Just this impossible signal coming from absolute nothingness. His hand hovered over the navigation console, the rational part of his brain, the part that kept him alive through 6 years of deep space hauling, told him to mark the coordinates for later investigation and continue to tighten. The storm front was advancing faster than predicted. His ship's engines already groaned under the increasing atmospheric resistance. The signal chimed again. This time it sounded less like a question and more like a plea. Jake sighed and turned the ship into the thickening dust. The engines whined in protest as he overrode the navigation lock, his trajectory curving toward the unknown signal. Well, this ought to be interesting. Flying through the perpetual sandstorm felt like navigating inside a giant sandblaster. The crystalline particles rattled against his viewport with the persistent hiss of static. Each microscopic shard capable of scoring through unprotected metal given enough time. His nav computer fought to maintain the course, compensating for wind shear that threatened to flip the small cargo vessel like a discarded ration wrapper. The coordinates led him to a particularly desolate basin where the sand drifts piled 30 meters high against wind-scoured rock formations. His scanner display flickered with interference, patterns that made no geological sense. Instead of the expected mineral deposits, the readings showed a massive subterranean crystalline structure, unlike anything in the Kepler 442 survey database. The energy readings were all wrong, not the steady output of natural crystals, but something more organized, more purposeful. The signal he'd been tracking originated directly from within that anomaly, buried deep beneath the shifting dunes. Landing protocols went out the airlock. The storm was worsening by the minute, reducing visibility to near 0. He set the ship down with a jarring thud that rattled his teeth, the landing strut sinking several feet into the unstable sand. External atmospheric readings showed conditions deteriorating rapidly, wind speeds approaching hurricane force, particulate density thick enough to sandblast his ship's exterior down to bare metal within hours. A lovely afternoon for a stroll. The suit-up procedure felt both familiar and utterly inadequate. His standard-issue environment suit was rated for basic planetary conditions, not this constant abrasive assault. The moment his airlock cycled open, the wind grabbed him like an angry giant, nearly pulling him off the ramp. He activated his mag boots, the satisfying click of magnetic locks securing him to the ship's metal hull. His hand scanner pointed him toward a slight elevation in the dune field, a barely perceptible mound that didn't match the surrounding topography. The signal strength meter jumped with each step closer. 20 meters out, he spotted it, a metallic glint that flashed between blowing sand, something too regular, too polished to be natural rock formation. He started digging with the emergency shovel from his survival kit. The crystalline sand resisted every movement, each scoop requiring more effort than the last. His gloves registered increasing wear patterns from the abrasive particles. After 10 minutes of exhausting work, the shape began to emerge, smooth, flowing curves that looked more like poured liquid than constructed panels. There were no visible seams, no bolts, no welding marks. The material reflected the stormlight in strange prismatic patterns. The full outline revealed itself as an escape pod, though unlike any human design he'd ever seen. It possessed an organic quality, as if grown rather than manufactured. A single hatch sat flush with the curved surface marked with symbols that resembled musical notation, more than warning labels. He keyed his comm. "Morrison to ship, come in." Static answered, the storm interfering with even short-range communications. He tried 3 more frequencies with the same result. The realization settled in his gut. He was completely cut off from his ship, standing beside alien technology in conditions that could kill him in minutes. Just perfect. Human engineering favored right angles and visible fasteners. Everything had an obvious purpose, a logical assembly. This pod looked like it had been poured from liquid metal, that then decided to freeze mid-flow. There were no seams, no access panels, no familiar latches or pressure locks. Jake ran his gloved hand over the surface. It felt impossibly smooth, like polished stone worn down by centuries of running water. The material should have been freezing in the bitter wind, but it held a persistent warmth that defied the ambient temperature. He circled the buried object, looking for any indication of an entry point. The symbols etched near what he assumed was the hatch resembled fluid musical notes more than technical markings. They offered no practical guidance. Standard emergency protocols dictated external manual releases precisely for situations like this. Apparently, these designers hadn't gotten the memo. The storm continued to rage around him, sand piling up against his boots. Time was not on his side. The plasma cutter seemed like the obvious solution. He set it to medium intensity, enough to slice through titanium alloys. The blue energy beam hit the hull and did something entirely unexpected. It slid off like water flowing over glass. The surface absorbed the energy without scorching, without even warming noticeably. He tried 3 different angles with the same result. The material seemed to actively reject the cutting beam, dispersing the energy across its entire surface. A perfect energy dispersal coating, brilliant and incredibly inconvenient. It was then that a sound came from inside the pod. A soft chime identical to the signal that had drawn him here, followed by a faint scrabbling noise. Something metal sliding against metal, then a series of taps. The sounds were too deliberate, too patterned to be debris shifting. Someone was definitely in there. Someone conscious and trying to get out or trying to communicate. The reality of the situation crystallized. This wasn't an archaeological find. This was a rescue operation. He switched tools, selecting the low-frequency resonator from his kit. It was designed to vibrate stuck cargo doors loose by finding their natural resonance frequency. Not exactly standard first contact equipment, but it was what he had. He pressed the emitter against the hull near the symbolic markings. The device hummed as he cycled through frequencies, watching for any reaction. On the 7th setting, something happened. The hull didn't open so much as it reconfigured. The material near the resonator flowed like mercury, particles sliding aside to form an opening exactly large enough for a person to crawl through. There were no moving parts, no visible mechanism, just matter rearranging itself at a fundamental level. The interior beyond was dark, but warm air spilled out, carrying a scent like ozone and something floral. The way was open. No instructions, no warnings, just an invitation into the unknown. Well, here goes nothing. The air that washed over his faceplate carried 2 distinct scents. The sharp tang of electrical discharge and something unexpectedly sweet, like jasmine mixed with an undertone of crushed mint. It was a strangely pleasant combination that felt entirely out of place in a crashed vehicle. Jake stepped through the opening he'd created, his boots making no sound on the smooth floor. His helmet light cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating floating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny stars. The interior told a story of violent impact. Control consoles were dark, their surfaces cracked like eggshells. Wires hung from the ceiling in tangled bundles, some still sparking intermittently. Strange organic-looking interfaces had melted and reformed into bizarre shapes from whatever heat the crash had generated. The whole compartment listed at a 15-degree angle, making every step feel slightly off balance. Emergency lighting strips along the floor pulsed a weak amber glow, creating more shadows than illumination. It was a tomb with better air filtration. In the farthest corner, tucked behind what remained of a shattered control panel, 2 points of light caught his beam and reflected it back with unnerving intensity. They weren't instrument lights, they moved, tracking his movement with deliberate focus. He adjusted his angle, widening the beam slightly. The lights belonged to a pair of eyes set in a pale face that couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old by human standards. She was humanoid, but clearly not human. Her skin had a slight opalescent quality that caught the light strangely, and her ears came to delicate points that twitched at the sound of his respirator. Large dark eyes dominated her face, showing white all around the irises but no panic, just intense focused curiosity. She made a sound that wasn't a cry or a whimper but a complex warble that rose and fell in 3 distinct pitches. His translator remained silent, offering no interpretation. She clutched a damaged device against her chest with both hands. It was about the size of a datapad but shaped like a smoothed riverstone, with several hairline cracks visible across its surface. Her fingers, too long and slender to be entirely human, maintained a protective grip that suggested this object mattered more than her own safety. Her clothing consisted of layered silvery fabric that had torn in several places, revealing skin beneath that showed minor cuts and bruises. None appeared serious. What struck him most wasn't her alien features or the strange technology. It was her posture. She wasn't cowering or hiding. She was observing him with the focused intensity of a scientist studying a new specimen. Her head tilted slightly as she took in his environment suit, the tools on his belt, the light on his helmet. She looked more like she was evaluating her options than awaiting rescue. There was a determination in her expression that felt decades older than her apparent physical age. The pieces clicked together in his mind. This wasn't some military scout or exploration specialist. The small size, the delicate features, the way she protected that device, she was a child. A child traveling alone in an escape pod that had crash-landed on a hostile world, light years from anything resembling civilization. The investigation was over. The parameters had just changed completely. His mission shifted from scientific curiosity to pure necessity in the space of a single heartbeat. Protocol, regulations, first contact procedures, none of it mattered compared to getting this small, unafraid alien child out of a wrecked pod on a planet that wanted to bury them both. Well, this just got complicated. His helmet-mounted translator emitted a series of beeps, then displayed 3 words that perfectly summarized the situation. Incompatible root languages. It tried again, producing syntactic garbage that mixed mathematical symbols with what looked like grocery list items. The device had handled 17 human dialects and 3 recognized alien trade languages without issue, but whatever she was speaking might as well have been random noise filtered through a broken synthesizer. So much for universal communication protocols. He kept his movement slow and deliberate, holding his hands open and away from his tools. "I'm here to help," he said in clear standard, enunciating each word with exaggerated care. "You're safe now." The words sounded absurd even to him. They were in a crashed alien pod on a hostile world with a sandstorm raging outside. Safe wasn't exactly the operative condition. She responded with a rapid sequence of melodic tones that rose and fell like water flowing over stones. Her voice possessed a musical quality that made standard sound flat and utilitarian by comparison. The sounds grouped into patterns that suggested grammar and syntax, but his translator just flashed red error indicators. She tilted her head, watching his lack of reaction with apparent curiosity rather than frustration. He tapped his chest plate. "Jake." The single syllable hung in the air between them. She studied him for a moment, then pointed one slender finger at her own chest. "Lyra." The word came out clear and unmistakable, though her pronunciation carried a soft lilt at the end. Progress. A name. His translator actually processed this one, displaying the characters LYRA on its tiny screen. It was something. It was everything, really. She held up the damaged device she'd been clutching. Now that he could see it properly, the design became clearer. An oval-shaped unit about the size of his palm, with what appeared to be organic circuitry visible through hairline cracks in the casing. Several crystalline components had come loose and lay scattered in her lap. She pointed at the broken unit, then at his toolkit, then made a series of gestures with her hands. Rotating motions, pressing motions, connecting motions. The universal language of broken technology transcended species barriers. Her meaning was perfectly clear even without words. The device wasn't just personal property, it was their only chance at proper communication. Everything else could wait. Survival, rescue, explanations about why a child was traveling alone in deep space. All of it required them to understand each other first. He unclipped his toolkit from his belt and laid it on the floor between them. The standard issue field repair set wasn't designed for alien biocircuity, but it contained precision tools that might work on the mechanical components. Lyra watched with intense focus as he selected micro drivers and mag tweezers. Her eyes tracked each tool with recognition. Apparently, screw heads and connection ports followed some universal engineering principles. The immediate problem narrowed to something he could actually solve. Fix the translator. Establish communication. Everything else was theoretical until they could talk. For a cargo hauler who spent most of his life repairing malfunctioning equipment, this was familiar territory. The circumstances were unusual, but the task itself felt comforting in its simplicity. One problem at a time. Starting with the broken device in a small alien's hands, Jake unrolled his toolkit on the smooth floor of the pod. The worn leather pouch contained the essentials for a cargo hauler: heavy-duty cutters, impact wrenches, industrial sealant. Tools designed for prying open stuck cargo containers and hammering misaligned components into submission. Microsurgery on alien circuitry wasn't exactly in the job description. Lyra watched with unwavering focus, her large eyes tracking each tool as he laid them out. She hadn't moved from her protective position behind the shattered console, but her posture shifted from defensive to analytical. The damaged translator device remained cradled in her hands like a wounded bird. The internals of the device revealed themselves as he carefully pried open the casing. Human tech used silicon and copper. This looked more like a hybrid of organic tissue and crystallized light. Delicate filament strands pulsed with faint bioluminescence between hair-thin channels of what appeared to be liquid crystal. Several components had detached from their mountings during the crash, their crystalline structures showing microscopic fractures. The soldering iron from his kit proved immediately useless. When he touched the tip to a connection point, the surrounding material melted and fused into an opaque blob rather than forming a clean bond. Apparently, their technology didn't appreciate blunt force intervention. Lyra leaned forward, pointing one slender finger at a specific crystalline node that had come loose from its housing. Then she gestured toward a tool in his kit, the sonic driver, typically used for vibrating corrosion from thread patterns. Her meaning was clear despite the language barrier. She knew this technology. She understood its repair. He selected the driver and set it to its lowest frequency setting, barely more than a faint hum through his gloves. When he touched the tip to the loose component, something remarkable happened. The crystal chimed softly, a clear musical note that hung in the air for a full second before fading. The node glowed with a soft blue light and seemed to orient itself toward the housing it had detached from. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, an improvised cross-species repair team. Lyra would point to a component, then to a specific tool, sometimes making minute adjustments with her fingers to indicate rotation speed or pressure. He followed her silent instructions, the sonic driver proving surprisingly effective on the crystalline connections. The organic filaments required more delicate handling. He used micro-tweezers to carefully realign them while she watched with critical intensity. Her understanding of the device's internal architecture was clearly intimate. She knew exactly which connections mattered and in what sequence they needed attention. The final component clicked into place with a sound like a tiny musical box closing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the device began to hum, a low harmonic tone that vibrated through his gloves. The hairline cracks across its surface began to glow with soft white light that pulsed in rhythm with the hum. The screen, which had been dark and fractured, now showed a series of flowing symbols that swirled like liquid before settling into a stable pattern. The repair was complete. The silence that had defined their interaction thus far now felt charged with imminent change. Whatever came next would be spoken rather than gestured. The quiet collaboration had reached its inevitable conclusion. The repaired device emitted a soft chime that was both familiar and alien, the same melodic sequence that had drawn him through the sandstorm, now purified into clear, perfect tones. Lyra's face transformed instantly. The intense focus she had maintained throughout the repair softened into something vulnerable and hopeful. Her large eyes widened slightly, the reflection of the device's soft glow making them look like twin moons. She held the unit carefully as though it were made of glass rather than whatever advanced composite it actually was. She spoke into it, her voice a series of rising and falling notes that flowed like water. The device processed her words, its internal lights flickering in patterns that suggested computational activity. Tiny crystalline components pulsed in sequence, casting shifting patterns across her face and the pod's dark interior. The wait felt interminable. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault against the hull, a constant reminder that time was not their friend. The first output from the translator was a distorted garble of mismatched phonemes and glitchy static. It sounded like several languages being played simultaneously through broken speakers. Another failure. Just what they needed. Jake didn't hesitate. He adjusted the frequency modulator on his wrist comp, syncing its output to match the strange harmonic signature of Lyra's device. The modulator was designed for aligning communication equipment with non-standard planetary networks, not for facilitating first contact with alien children. But improvisation had become the order of the day. He spoke slowly, keeping his words simple and distinct. Can you understand me? Each word hung in the air between them, bare and unadorned. The device whirred softly, its lights cycling through a new pattern. Lyra listened with her head cocked to one side, her pointed ears twitching slightly at the unfamiliar sounds. She responded with another musical phrase, this one shorter and ending on a questioning note. The device processed for 3 full seconds, an eternity in communication terms. Then the synthesized voice emerged, halting and mechanical but unmistakably clear in its meaning. You, help. 2 words. No poetry, no elegant phrasing. Just a stark statement of fact that cut through all the complexity of their situation. It was a miracle of understatement. The bridge between their species consisted of a subject and a verb, but it was enough. It changed everything in the space between heartbeats. Jake met her gaze and saw the understanding there. She knew he comprehended her. I help, he said, the words feeling both inadequate and profound. And for the first time since he'd entered the pod, her serious expression broke into a smile. It transformed her entire face, making her look exactly like what she was, a child who had just been thrown a lifeline in the dark. Well, that was a start. The question felt too large for the cramped space of the pod. Where your people? Jake asked, keeping his voice low. The words hung between them, simple and impossibly complex. The translator device processed the query, its lights flickering as it searched for equivalents in a database that had never encountered concepts like this before. Lyra's expression shifted immediately. The hopeful light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something darker and more distant. Her slender fingers tightened around the repaired translator. She responded with a series of soft tones that the device struggled to interpret. The synthesized voice emerged haltingly, piecing together fragments. Great noise, it said, then static. Skyfire. Falling. The words painted a picture of chaos and destruction, but whether it described an attack, an accident, or some natural catastrophe remained unclear. The translation kept breaking down, producing non-sequiturs and garbled phrases that obscured more than they revealed. She pointed upward with one delicate finger, gesturing past the damaged ceiling of the pod beyond the sandstorm, toward the stars where her home presumably existed, or had existed. The story emerged in broken pieces, filtered through the limited vocabulary of a newly established translation protocol. She didn't know where her people were. That much became clear through the fragmented narrative. She only knew she was alone, that she had been put into this pod with specific instructions. She mentioned her mama multiple times, the word translating clearly each time. The device struggled with the context surrounding that word. Protocols, instructions, something about a human helping. The tale was clearly one of escape rather than exploration. This wasn't a scientific mission gone wrong. This was an evacuation. Jake watched her small hands gesture as she spoke, illustrating concepts the translator couldn't handle. She mimed an explosion with her fingers opening outward, then made a falling motion with her hand. She touched her chest when she mentioned being alone. The pieces fell into place with grim clarity. She wasn't an explorer or an ambassador. She was a refugee. A child refugee traveling in an escape pod with whatever she could carry, which appeared to be just the clothes she wore and the now repaired translator. This sophisticated pod with its self-healing hull and organic technology represented not a vessel of discovery but a lifeboat. Possibly the only one. His simple rescue operation had just transformed into something entirely different. This wasn't about recovering alien technology or making first contact for the scientific record. This was about custody, about responsibility for a child who had lost everything and now looked at him with those large, knowing eyes that had seen things he could only imagine through the filter of a struggling translation device. The weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. He was no longer just a cargo hauler who'd found something interesting. He was now the only thing standing between this child and a hostile universe. Well, that escalated quickly. Lyra's expression shifted from tentative to focused, her large eyes gaining a sudden solemn gravity that seemed too old for her small face. The translator device emitted a soft preparatory chime. "Mama said," and she began, the synthesized voice forming the words with careful precision. The phrasing sounded rehearsed, like something repeated many times until the syllables became muscle memory. She looked directly at Jake, her gaze unwavering. The sandstorm outside continued its relentless assault on the pod, but inside, the air felt suddenly still and charged. The instructions emerged in clean, simple phrases that the translator handled with unusual clarity. "If a human helps us," the device synthesized. The word "us" landed with particular weight. It wasn't the singular pronoun he'd been hearing. This wasn't just about Lyra. The plural suggested a broader context, a larger group or cause that extended beyond this single child in a crashed pod. The sentence structure felt formal, almost ceremonial, as if she were reciting from a prepared text rather than speaking spontaneously. Her small hands moved to her neck, fingers finding a nearly invisible chain that lay against her skin. The material was so fine it looked like a strand of light rather than metal. She unclasped it with a practiced motion, the action too smooth and confident for a child's fumbling fingers. This had been demonstrated to her, practiced until it became automatic. She held out her closed fist, something glowing softly between her slender fingers. The light pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to sync with the faint hum of the repaired translator. The gesture wasn't spontaneous gratitude. It was too deliberate, too specific. This was a transaction that had been anticipated and planned for. Someone, her mother presumably, had prepared her for this exact scenario. The instructions included contingency planning for meeting a human who offered assistance. The implications unfolded slowly. Her people knew about humans. They had opinions about humans. They had protocols for interactions with humans, and they considered this situation likely enough to prepare a child for it. Jake watched the glowing light pulse between her fingers. The object felt important not because of its apparent value, but because of the ritual surrounding it. This wasn't a child offering a random trinket. This was an ambassador following diplomatic protocol, however unconventional the circumstances. The weight of the moment settled around them. She was executing orders given by a mother who might be lost forever, carrying out instructions that represented someone's hope for a future that might no longer exist. The simple act of offering this object connected them to a story much larger than either of them could currently understand. The resolution crystallized in the space between her outstretched hand and his hesitation. This wasn't about thanking him for fixing her translator or offering shelter from the storm. This was an exchange that had been predetermined by someone who saw possibilities where others might see only desperation. Lyra's serious expression never wavered. She was waiting for him to complete the transaction her mother had planned for. following orders with the solemn dignity of someone who understood their importance, even if she didn't fully understand their purpose. The glowing object in her hand represented both a gift and a test, and the next move was his. Lyra uncurled her fingers. The object in her palm looked less like jewelry and more like physics reconsidered. It was a teardrop shape that seemed to contain its own light source, the material shifting between solid crystal and pure energy, depending on how the light caught it. The surface wasn't smooth but featured intricate patterns that spiraled inward toward the center, each line finer than a human hair. The designs resembled mathematical equations more than decorative motifs, patterns that suggested function rather than ornamentation. It pulsed with a soft, warm light that brightened and faded in a rhythm that felt organic, like a heartbeat seen through closed eyelids. The craftsmanship was clearly ancient. The patterns showed a level of precision that made the advanced technology of the escape pod look crude by comparison. Where the pod systems were functional and practical, this object felt like something that had been worked on for generations, perfected over centuries rather than manufactured. The light within it wasn't simply reflected. It seemed to originate from somewhere inside the crystal itself, flowing through the intricate channels carved into its structure. It moved like liquid sunlight through complex plumbing. Her small hand pressed the object into his gloved palm. The translator device spoke the words with unusual clarity. "It is very important." The understatement was almost comical. He could feel the pendant's warmth through the thick fabric of his environment suit glove, a surprising heat that shouldn't have been possible in the pod's cool interior. The pulsing rhythm synchronized with his own heartbeat after a moment, the light brightening and fading in time with his pulse. The effect was unsettlingly intimate, as if the object was calibrating itself to his biological rhythms. The pendant felt alive in a way that defied explanation. It wasn't simply warm. It seemed to possess a gentle vibration that resonated through his hand and up his arm. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, just profoundly strange. More than its physical properties, the weight of the gesture settled heavily. This small child was handing him what was clearly her most valuable possession, possibly the only thing of value she had left in the universe. She wasn't trading it for passage or protection. She was giving it because her mother's instructions said to give it to any human who helped. The trust implicit in that gesture felt heavier than any cargo he'd ever hauled. He accepted the pendant, his fingers closing around it. The warmth spread through his glove, the pulsing rhythm continuing its steady beat against his palm. He didn't understand what the object was, what it did, or why it was important, but he understood the gesture completely. A child who had lost everything was giving him her last treasure simply because he had offered help. The transaction felt both ancient and utterly new, an exchange of trust that needed no complicated terms or conditions. The glowing teardrop in his hand represented a connection that transcended their language barrier, their species difference, their entire strange circumstances. It was, he suspected, the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Well, that's not something you find in the cargo manifest. Jake dealt in quantifiable reality. Mass could be measured in kilograms, thrust in newtons, and his decisions in credit balances. The glowing pendant in his hand defied all these metrics. It was physically light, weighing perhaps no more than a standard data chip, yet it carried an immeasurable psychological weight. The warmth that radiated from it through his glove felt like a living thing. The gentle pulse against his palm, a constant silent reminder that this object was more than ornamentation. It felt significant in a way that went beyond its obvious alien origins. This wasn't a souvenir. It was a key, a responsibility, a question he hadn't asked but now had to answer. The central question echoed in his mind with simple, brutal clarity. Why give this to him? Why this specific object? Why follow instructions that seemed to anticipate this exact scenario? He looked from the softly glowing teardrop in his hand to Lyra's face, seeking some explanation beyond the translated words. For a long moment, the translator device remained silent between them. No electronic mediation was necessary. Her expression provided all the explanation he would get. Her large eyes held no doubt, no hesitation, only a calm certainty that felt ancient in its conviction. She had done exactly what she was supposed to do. The translated words came then, clean and simple. Mama's instruction. The phrase landed not as an explanation but as a fundamental law of her existence. There was no because, no conditional clause, no discussion of merits or rationale. It was a statement of fact as concrete as planetary gravity or engine thrust. In her universe, when a human showed kindness, you gave them this specific object. The gesture felt both profoundly simple and impossibly complex. It suggested a cultural framework where gratitude wasn't expressed with words, but with the transfer of what appeared to be a significant artifact. The rules of this exchange had been established long before either of them entered this pod. The mystery surrounding the pendant deepened with every passing second. What was its purpose? Why had her mother considered this specific exchange important enough to drill into a child's memory? The questions multiplied, but the bond between them solidified into something more tangible. Her trust was absolute. She had followed her instructions without hesitation, giving her most valuable possession to a stranger based on a cultural protocol he didn't understand. His part of the transaction was suddenly clear. He had to honor that trust by accepting the gift and the responsibility that came with it. He gave a single nod, meeting her steady gaze. The movement felt inadequate for the moment, but words seemed even less appropriate. He carefully placed the pendant into a sealed interior pocket on his suit, the one typically reserved for sensitive data chips or emergency meds. The fabric closed over it with a satisfying click of magnetic seals. The pulse of warmth became a faint sensation against his chest, a constant, gentle reminder of the new variable in his previously predictable existence. "I will keep it," he said, the words simple and direct. They felt like both a promise and an acceptance of terms he didn't fully comprehend. The weight of the pendant against his chest felt exactly right, a physical manifestation of a debt he now owed to a small alien child and the mother who had prepared her for this exact moment. Well, that's not going in the cargo log. The pod's environmental systems chose that moment to fail with a finality that felt almost personal. The amber emergency lights flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness except for the soft glow from Lyra's translator and the faint illumination from his suit indicators. The low hum of life support machinery stuttered into silence, leaving only the persistent howl of the sandstorm outside as accompaniment. The air immediately began to feel heavier, the oxygen concentration dropping at a rate his suit sensors flagged with priority alerts. They had minutes, not hours, before the atmosphere became unbreathable. Jake's decision required approximately 3 seconds of consideration. The rational choice was clear and obvious. Seal his suit, radio for backup from the nearest security outpost, and let the proper authorities handle first contact protocols. Interstellar Regulation 29B was explicit about unauthorized transport of unidentified extraterrestrial biological entities. Violation meant mandatory detainment, psychological evaluation, and almost certainly permanent revocation of his hauling license. His entire career, his entire livelihood, hinged on following established procedures for situations exactly like this one. He looked at Lyra. She clutched her functioning translator with both hands, her large eyes watching him with an expression that held no fear, only quiet expectation. Her trust was absolute and unshaken by the failing systems around them. Then his hand went to the sealed pocket on his chest, where the pendant rested against his sternum. The warmth pulsed through the fabric, a steady rhythm that felt like a counterpoint to his racing thoughts. The authorities had procedures, regulations, and containment protocols. They did not have a child's absolute trust or a mysterious object that glowed with the weight of someone's final instructions. The logical choice evaporated like oxygen in a breached compartment. Some equations couldn't be solved with regulations and risk assessment. He reached out, his gloved hand looking enormous next to her small frame. "Come with me," he said, the words simple and direct. The translator processed the phrase without difficulty. Lyra nodded once and took his hand without hesitation, her slender fingers wrapping around 2 of his. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Getting her into his ship required some improvisation. The spare environment suit in his storage locker was comically oversized for her frame, the arms and legs dangling several inches too long. He sealed her into it anyway, the helmet resting awkwardly on her small shoulders. The air supply would last long enough for the short trip across the storm-ravaged surface. She followed his instructions with quick, precise movements, her adaptability both impressive and slightly unsettling for someone her apparent age. He guided her into the ship's cramped passenger seat, fastening the safety harness around her small form. The restraints were designed for fully grown haulers, not delicate alien children, but they would have to suffice. She sat perfectly still, her large eyes taking in the cockpit's utilitarian controls and flashing indicators with calm curiosity. The translator device rested in her lap, its soft glow illuminating her face in the dim light. She looked less like a frightened refugee and more like a visiting dignitary surveying substandard accommodations, a 7-year-old queen in exile, waiting to see what her unlikely protector would do next. The ship's systems came online with familiar hums and beeps. Jake settled into the pilot's seat, his hands moving over controls he could operate blindfolded. The rational part of his brain continued listing all the regulations he was violating and all the consequences he would face. The pendant pulsed warmly against his chest, a constant reminder that some decisions transcended logic and procedure. He had made the illogical choice. He was now responsible for a child who didn't belong to his species, his world, or his understanding of the universe. Well, this should end well. The ship lifted with a groan of straining engines, sand cascading from its hull in shimmering sheets. Beneath them, the escape pod vanished beneath the shifting dunes, becoming just another anonymous bump on Kepler 442's scarred surface. The storm continued its relentless assault, the viewports momentarily turning opaque with driven crystalline particles before the clearing thrusters kicked in. Jake watched the scanner display as the pod signal faded into background static, the strange harmonic signature swallowed by the planet's natural interference. One chapter closed, another beginning with significantly more questions than answers. His hands moved over the navigation console with practiced efficiency, but the course he plotted was anything but routine. Instead of the core worlds with their official ports and regulatory oversight, he set coordinates for Titan Outpost on the fringe. The place was little more than a collection of pressurized modules bolted to a moon, known for two things: cheap refueling and a conspicuous lack of questions. The navigation computer accepted the coordinates without comment, but the route that unfolded on the screen represented a significant deviation from his authorized flight plan. This wasn't a detour. This was a fundamental change of direction. He reached for the transponder control, his finger hovering over the switch that would broadcast his identity and flight path to every monitoring station in the sector. Standard procedure demanded it remain active at all times. His thumb pressed the switch down. The familiar ping of the active transponder died, replaced by an unsettling silence. The icon on his console shifted from green to a steady warning red. He was now a ghost on the scanners, an unregistered blip moving through controlled space. Every regulation he'd followed for years was now officially violated. His career, built on a foundation of reliability and rule following, was probably over. Lyra watched the main view screen as Kepler 442 shrank behind them. The orange-brown sphere, wreathed in perpetual storm systems, grew smaller with each passing second. Her expression was unreadable, a calm mask that gave nothing away. She showed no visible sadness at leaving the world where she'd nearly died, no fear of the unknown ahead. Her large eyes simply observed, taking in the star-dusted blackness that replaced the raging sandstorm. She held her translator device loosely in her lap, its soft glow the only light source in the darkened cockpit aside from the console displays. After several minutes of silence, she spoke a soft series of tones into the translator. The device processed the query and produced a simple, synthesized question that hung in the air between them. Where now? Jake stared at the star chart on his screen, the plotted course to Titan Outpost looking terribly inadequate. He had no good answer. He was making this up as he went, flying on instinct and a rapidly diminishing supply of rational choices. He couldn't tell her they were going to a rundown outpost where he hoped to blend in. He couldn't explain the complex web of interstellar law he was breaking. The words that came out were the only ones that felt true. A safe place, he said, the translation feeling hopelessly inadequate. The pendant pulsed warmly against his chest, a constant, gentle reminder of the weight he now carried. Its rhythm was steady and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of his own heart. His life of predictable routes between mining colonies and orbital stations, of simple mechanical problems and straightforward cargo manifests, was definitively over. That existence belonged to the man he was an hour ago, before he'd dug a small alien child out of the sand. There was no turning back. The decision had been made the moment he'd altered course toward that strange signal. Every action since had simply been following that initial choice to its logical, illogical conclusion. He had answered the call, however strange and unexpected it had been. The option of refusal had evaporated somewhere between the dying pod and the warmth of the gift now resting against his heart. His hand settled on the warp drive engagement lever. The engines spooled up with a rising whine that vibrated through the ship's frame. Stars on the view screen began to stretch into luminous streaks as the ship accelerated past light speed. Kepler 442 vanished behind them, becoming just another anonymous dot in a sea of countless others. The familiar, comforting dust was gone, replaced by the infinite unknown of plotted space. Well, no refunds on this ticket. The pendant lay on the cockpit console, glowing softly beside a half-empty coffee bulb. In the steady light of the ship's instruments, its internal structures revealed astonishing complexity. What had appeared as simple crystal from a distance now showed intricate channels and nodes that pulsed with light in rhythmic patterns. The pathways resembled a microscopic city map, designed by someone who thought in fluid dynamics rather than straight lines. Each pulse traveled through the structure with purpose, following routes that seemed both predetermined and strangely adaptive. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost intrusive, like watching someone else's heartbeat. Jake ran every scan his ship's limited sensors could manage. The results were uniformly useless. Standard spectral analysis showed no reflection patterns. The light wasn't bouncing off the surface but emanating from within. Thermal imaging registered the warmth but couldn't identify the energy source. Radiation detectors remained stubbornly silent. The material composition defied classification, showing properties of both crystalline structures and organic tissue without fully matching either. It was as if the object had politely declined to provide its credentials to his inferior technology. The ship's computer logged 17 separate unknown readings before he gave up on getting meaningful data. The pulse continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by his attempts to analyze it. The warmth radiating from the object felt consistent, neither increasing nor decreasing despite hours of examination. Yet somehow the pendant gave the impression of attentiveness, as if it were aware of being observed. The light patterns seemed to shift minutely when he moved around the cockpit, the internal pathways adjusting their glow almost imperceptibly. It didn't feel like a random energy emission. It felt like a signal, a very patient, very persistent signal that wasn't meant for his instruments to decode. Lyra slept in the passenger seat, curled into a small ball with her translator device cradled against her chest. The exhaustion of her ordeal had finally caught up with her, her breathing deep and regular. The pendant's glow cast soft shadows across her peaceful face, the light pulsing in time with her breathing rhythm. The synchronization was too perfect to be coincidence. The object seemed attuned to her biological functions even from across the cockpit. Whatever connection existed between them operated on principles far beyond his understanding. The realization settled slowly but firmly. This wasn't jewelry. This wasn't art. The precision of its construction, the complexity of its internal structures, the way it seemed to interact with its environment, these were hallmarks of a tool. A device designed for a specific purpose that remained completely obscure. The teardrop shape felt less like an aesthetic choice and more like an engineered form factor. Something designed to be held or inserted or activated in some way he couldn't comprehend. The mysteries multiplied with every passing moment. What was its function? Why had Lyra's mother considered it so important that giving it to a helpful human became part of emergency protocols? Why did it seem both ancient and incredibly advanced simultaneously? The questions formed a chain that led back to the central, unsettling truth. He was now responsible for an object whose purpose, origin, and significance were complete unknowns. His entire life had narrowed to this small, warm, glowing question resting on his console. The pendant continued its steady pulse, indifferent to his confusion. The warm light seemed to hold answers to questions he hadn't even learned how to ask yet. Whatever this object was, whatever it represented, it clearly mattered. Lyra and her mother hadn't given him a token of gratitude. They had entrusted him with something significant, possibly something vital. The weight of that trust felt heavier than any cargo he'd ever hauled. The central question of his new life wasn't about survival or evasion anymore. It was about understanding what exactly now rested glowing on his console, pulsing with patient, silent purpose. Well, that's not in the operations manual. The translator device now spent more time inactive than not, resting on the console between them like a sleeping insect. Communication had shifted from carefully parsed sentences to something more intuitive. Jake demonstrated the food synthesizer's operation, pointing to the hydration symbol, then to the protein matrix selector. Lyra watched his movements with focused intensity, her large eyes missing nothing. Within 3 attempts, she was programming complex meal combinations without assistance, her slender fingers moving over the interface with surprising dexterity. The fear that had shadowed her features during their first hours together had been replaced by keen curiosity. She treated each new piece of technology not as a threat but as a puzzle to be solved. She pointed at the main view screen, where stars streamed past in luminous trails during warp travel. Her finger indicated a particularly bright cluster, and she made a soft questioning sound that needed no translation. Jake named the constellations he recognized from standard astrometric charts: Orion's Belt, the Southern Cross, the Navigator's Triangle. For the unfamiliar patterns, he invented names based on their shapes: the Broken Compass, the Silver River, the Three Sisters. She repeated the names with careful pronunciation, storing each one with the serious concentration of a student mastering vital information. The lessons went both ways. She showed him how her people grouped stars not by static shapes, but by harmonic resonance patterns, drawing connections between points of light based on their energy signatures rather than their positions. A shared language developed through gesture and shared experience rather than vocabulary. A tilted head meant confusion. A particular hand movement signaled hunger. The raising of eyebrows accompanied by a smile indicated amusement. They built their own lexicon of meaningful looks and simple gestures that conveyed more than the translator's halting sentences ever could. The awkwardness of their initial interactions faded into a comfortable rhythm of unspoken understanding. They could sit together for hours in the cockpit, working on separate tasks, communicating through glances and occasional gestures that had become second nature. Her trust solidified not because he shared her species or understood her culture, but because he consistently demonstrated kindness. When she struggled with the unfamiliar human food textures, he reprogrammed the synthesizer to create hybrids that combined nutritional requirements with flavors she found pleasing. When nightmares woke her trembling in the middle of the sleep cycle, he didn't demand explanations. He simply sat with her until the fear passed. His protection extended beyond physical safety to emotional security, creating an environment where she could gradually lower the defenses that circumstances had forced her to build. His motivation was equally simple. He protected her not because she represented first contact or valuable intelligence, but because she was a child who needed protection. The alien origins, the advanced technology, the mysterious pendant, all of it became secondary to the fundamental reality of a small being relying on him for survival. His decisions were based on her needs rather than regulations or strategic considerations. The complexities of interstellar politics mattered less than ensuring she had enough to eat and a safe place to sleep. The bond that formed between them needed no complicated explanation or philosophical justification. It was straightforward and robust, built on the simple foundation of one person helping another. Their differences in biology, origin, and experience became irrelevant compared to their shared reality as two beings trying to navigate an uncertain situation together. The connection felt more natural than any relationship based on shared species or culture could have been. Compassion proved to be the most universal technology they shared. It required no translation, followed no complicated protocols, and functioned perfectly across any divide. The simple act of caring for another being operated on principles that transcended language barriers or physiological differences. It was the one system that never experienced compatibility issues or required software updates. In the cold emptiness of space between two beings who should have been strangers, kindness became their common ground and their strongest connection. Well, that's one interface that never crashes. The docking clamps engaged with a series of metallic shutters that ran through the ship's frame. Titan Outpost hung in the viewport like a collection of rusted tin cans welded together by someone with a grudge against symmetry. Pressurized modules of various sizes jutted out at odd angles, connected by umbilical corridors that looked like they'd been installed as an afterthought. Navigation lights flickered inconsistently, some blinking red while others stayed dark entirely. The place advertised itself as a refueling station, but its real business was providing a space where people could disappear between the cracks of official records. No questions asked, no answers given. Perfect. Jake rehearsed the story in his mind as he powered down the engines. A lost child, the sole survivor of a freighter accident, no family, no identification. He'd found her wandering near the crash site, disoriented but unharmed. The details needed to be vague enough to avoid verification, but specific enough to sound plausible. He kept coming back to the same problem. Freighters didn't carry children as passengers, and crew members didn't bring their families on dangerous runs. The story had more holes than the outpost's radiation shielding. He couldn't mention the alien pod. He couldn't show the pendant currently glowing against his chest inside its sealed pocket. Both would trigger immediate security protocols and more attention than they could handle. The pendant pulsed warmly, a constant reminder that their situation was far more complicated than a simple rescue operation. Lyra pulled the hood of her oversized environment suit over her head, carefully tucking her pointed ears beneath the fabric. The suit swallowed her small frame, making her look like a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. She practiced keeping her head bowed, hiding her face in shadow. The attempt to appear human was both touching and utterly inadequate. The station commander met them at the airlock, his uniform stained with something that looked like hydraulic fluid. He eyed them with the bored suspicion of someone who'd seen every possible variation of shady behavior. His gaze lingered on Lyra's covered head, then moved to Jake's face. "New arrival needs registration," he said, his voice flat. "Regulations." The word sounded like a joke he didn't find funny. Jake filed the report using a public terminal in the docking bay. The form asked for details he didn't have: ship registration numbers, crash coordinates, next of kin. He entered approximations and generalizations, his fingers moving quickly over the grimy keyboard. The story felt thinner with every field he completed. A human child surviving a freighter crash without a scratch? No identification? No emergency beacon recovery? The narrative wouldn't survive even basic scrutiny. The commander watched over his shoulder, saying nothing but radiating skepticism. They were assigned a temporary room in the residential module, a space barely large enough for 2 fold-down bunks and a sanitary unit. The air carried the persistent smell of recycled oxygen and ozone. Payment was taken from Jake's credit account without discussion. The outpost operated on advanced deduction systems. The commander handed him a key card with a worn magnetic strip. 3 days maximum, he said. Then you need to file migration papers or move on. The unspoken addition hung in the air, or face questions you probably can't answer. The room's door hissed shut behind them, sealing them in a space that felt both claustrophobic and Baolu. For now they were safe. The immediate dangers of Kepler 442 were behind them, replaced by the slow-burn threat of bureaucratic discovery. The pendant pulsed against Jake's chest, its rhythm steady and insistent. The warm glow through his shirt served as a constant reminder that their story was far from over. It had barely begun. This wasn't a conclusion. It was an intermission. Well, the accommodations leave something to be desired. The first cry cut through the outpost's usual hum of machinery and distant, muffled conversations. It wasn't a scream of fear, but a sharp, guttural word in her native tongue that the translator on the nightstand remained silent about. The sound was all the more startling for its strangeness, a syllable filled with a pain that needed no translation. Jake was awake instantly, the ingrained habit of a light sleeper who'd spent years in ships where any unusual noise could mean a hull breach. He found her curled into a tight ball on the narrow bunk, shivering despite the room's controlled temperature. Her eyes were wide open but seeing something far beyond the metal ceiling of their tiny quarters. She was speaking, the words a rapid, breathless stream of melodic tones now familiar to his ear, though their meaning remained just out of reach. The translator picked up only fragments, synthesizing the same phrase it had managed on the planet: Skyfire. The word landed with new weight in the dark room. No longer a curious description, but a clear marker of trauma. This wasn't a simple memory surfacing. The trembling that racked her small frame, the way her breath hitched between phrases, the sheer visceral terror in her expression. This was a nightmare. A recurring one, judging by the practiced way her body reacted, tensing against an invisible assault. She was trapped in a loop, reliving the event that had put her in that escape pod. The calm, observant child from the daylight hours was gone, replaced by a raw nerve of remembered terror. Her description emerged in broken pieces, filtered through the translator's limited capacity for conveying horror. "A great light," she whispered, her hands coming up to shield her eyes as if from a blinding flash. "A sound that hurts the inside." Her fingers pressed against her temples. "Falling. Everything is falling." The phrases were simple, stark, and devastating. They painted a picture of sudden, catastrophic violence from which escape was the only option. This was the origin story of her solitude. Her hands, which had been pressed to her head, suddenly clawed at the chest of her sleep tunic, searching for something that wasn't there. The motion was instinctive, desperate. She was feeling for the pendant, for the familiar weight and warmth that had been her constant companion until she gave it away. The gesture was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Even in the depths of a nightmare, her body sought the comfort of the object she had willingly surrendered. On the nightstand, the pendant itself seemed to respond. Its usual steady, gentle pulse quickened almost imperceptibly, the rhythm shifting to match her escalating distress. The light within the crystal flared slightly, casting sharper shadows across the room. It was as if the object was resonating with her fear, reacting to the emotional echo of the trauma it was intimately connected to. The synchronization was undeniable and deeply unsettling. The reality of her experience solidified in that moment. The terror was not abstract. It was a real event that had scorched itself into her memory, a horror she carried with her every moment, waking or sleeping. The nightmare was a window into the cataclysm she had somehow survived. The calm demeanor she maintained during the day was a formidable act of will, a dam holding back a river of fear. Understanding washed over him with cold clarity. Her gift to him had been an act of incredible courage. She hadn't just given him a precious object, she had given away her talisman, her comfort, the one physical thing that connected her to her past and her people. She had handed it over while still trembling from the aftershocks of whatever disaster had orphaned her, following her mother's instructions with a trust that now seemed breathtaking. She had divested herself of security while still desperately in need of it. The transaction he had accepted so simply on Kepler 442 was suddenly revealed in its full complexity. The pendant was not merely a gift. It was a burden, and by giving it to him she had shared that burden. She had passed along a piece of her history, her trauma, and her responsibility, trusting him to carry it for her. The weight of it against his chest now felt different, heavier, more significant, more solemn. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. The shivering gradually subsided, her breathing slowly returning to normal. The nightmare's grip loosened. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false promises of safety. Instead, he made a vow aloud to the dark, quiet room, his voice low but clear. "I will be worthy of it." The words were for her, even if she couldn't understand them yet, and for himself. The promise covered everything: the child, the nightmare, the trust, and the glowing, pulsing weight of the responsibility now his to carry. Well, no pressure. The week settled into a rhythm dictated by the outpost's failing infrastructure. The incident on Kepler 4042 became a sealed chapter, a quiet secret shared between two people and a softly glowing object. Jake found work maintaining the station's aging systems, swapping out power couplings and generators and patching leaks in air scrubbers. The work was familiar, the grease under his nails a welcome return to normalcy. Payment came in credits and a grudging tolerance of his presence. The station's residents were a transient collection of mechanics, traders, and people avoiding official attention. They asked no questions and he offered no answers. It was an unspoken agreement that suited everyone. His external focus was on machinery, but his internal sensors were always scanning. Every new arrival in the docking bay was assessed. Every overheard conversation filtered for keywords. He watched for any sign of increased security presence, any official-looking vessels, any interest in a man traveling with a small child. The paranoia was a low-grade hum in the background of his thoughts, a constant calculation of risks and exit strategies. He checked the public bulletins daily, searching for any mention of unidentified vessels or missing alien children. The silence was both a relief and a new kind of tension. Lyra adapted with a speed that was both impressive and unnerving. Her standard improved daily, the musical lilt of her native language flattening into the utilitarian tones of human speech. She learned to ask for food by its synthesized names, to recognize the shift change alarms, to navigate the cramped corridors without drawing attention. To any casual observer, she was just another station kid, a little quiet perhaps, a little too observant for her age. She spent hours studying on a borrowed datapad, consuming information about human history and culture, with a focus that felt more like reconnaissance than education. Only in unguarded moments did the facade slip. Jake would find her staring out of a viewport at the star-dusted blackness, her expression distant and unreadable. The flat human tones would vanish, replaced by a soft, almost subvocal hum in her native language. In those moments, she wasn't a child learning a new world. She was a rememberer of a lost one. She was measuring the distance between herself and home in light years, and the calculation clearly weighed on her. Then she would sense his presence. The mask would slide back into place and she would be just Lyra again, asking about dinner or showing him a new word she'd learned. The pendant remained their silent third companion. Jake kept it in a locked drawer, but sometimes at night he would take it out. In the dark of their quarters, it glowed with that same patient, persistent light. It felt less like a piece of technology waiting to be understood, and more like a promise waiting to be kept, or a countdown waiting to reach zero. The warmth against his palm was a constant reminder that their current life was temporary, a pause between the initial emergency and whatever came next. The object was a question mark at the end of a sentence he hadn't finished writing. He had no long-term plan. The options were limited and deeply unsatisfactory. He could try to raise her here on the fringe, always hiding, always fearing discovery. He could attempt to integrate her into human society with forged documents, a gamble that would require lies upon lies. He could keep running, moving from outpost to outpost, never settling, never building a real life for either of them. None of the choices felt right. He was a cargo hauler, not a father, not a spy, not a revolutionary. The call to adventure had been answered with a desperate act of rescue, but the road beyond that initial choice was completely obscured. The journey had definitively begun the moment he turned his ship toward that strange signal. But the destination remained a mystery, its coordinates written in a language of light and warmth that he couldn't yet decipher. The only certainty was that they were moving toward something, pulled by a gravity he didn't understand, following a map they would have to read as they went. While navigational certainty was always overrated anyway, 15 years had settled into Jake's bones like fine dust. The emergency was no longer an emergency. It was just life. The pendant rested in its usual spot in his workbench drawer, its glow a familiar nightlight in his quarters. He was on Titan base now, not the fringe outpost. The scenery had changed, but the work remained essentially the same. Different maintenance panels, identical malfunctioning hardware. He was currently elbow-deep in a primary data processor that was refusing to acknowledge a simple diagnostic command. The machine was obstinate, uncooperative, and currently filling the maintenance bay with the smooth, soulless strains of 20th century jazz. It had been stuck on this particular audio loop for 3 hours. It was a Tuesday. His life had become a study in predictable failure. Gravitational regulators needed constant recalibration. Oxygen scrubbers developed new and interesting leaks weekly, and every piece of equipment older than a decade had a personal vendetta against him. He'd traded the crystalline sand of Kepler 442 for the ice dust of Titan, but the fundamental equation remained unchanged. Something was always broken, and he was usually the one holding the wrench. The feel of alien sand under his boots, the haunting melody of a language not his own. These were memories that had faded into the background hum of a daily survival. They were stories he almost didn't believe himself anymore. The station AI, a program named Harold with a regrettable sense of humor, chose that moment to pipe up over the smooth jazz. "Diagnostic still running," it said in its placid, synthetic voice. "Hey, why did the chicken cross the Mobius strip?" It didn't wait for an answer. To get to the same side, the joke landed with a thud in the empty bay. Harold's comedy database was apparently stuck in a pre-spaceflight era. Jake sighed and adjusted his grip on the sonic driver. Some problems were beyond fixing. It was then that a new alert flashed on his wrist comp, a silent notification that overrode the processor's error messages. The signal appeared on the long-range comms array display, a pattern so complex it looked like an abstract painting. It wasn't a standard hail or a distress call. This was a quantum synchronization request, a handshake protocol so advanced most human ships couldn't generate it. The signal pulsed with an elegant mathematical beauty, each harmonic perfectly aligned. It was the most sophisticated transmission he'd ever seen, and it was pinging their station specifically. His tools lay forgotten on the processor housing. He watched the signal trace its intricate path across the monitor, a dance of energy and information that defied simple analysis. It wasn't broadcasting a general message. It was seeking one very specific thing: The pattern narrowed, focusing its search parameters with terrifying precision. The realization arrived cold and certain. It wasn't looking for the station. It wasn't looking for him. The pendant in his workbench drawer began to glow, not with its usual soft pulse, but with a fierce, urgent light that bled through the metal seams. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the workbench and up through the floor plates into his boots. The warmth he felt through the drawer was no longer gentle. It was insistent, a demanding pressure against his senses. The object he had carried for 15 years, through a dozen stations and twice as many jobs, was finally answering a call he couldn't hear. The past hadn't just remembered him. It had found his address and was knocking on the door. The quiet was over. Well, there goes the neighborhood. That single act of compassion on a dusty, forgotten world didn't just alter one man's path. It rerouted the destiny of two species. Jake's decision to answer an unknown signal became the pivot point for events far beyond his own life. The story of a pragmatic cargo hauler and the alien child he protected demonstrates that the universe's most sophisticated technology isn't found in quantum drives or advanced AI. It resides in the simple, profound act of empathy. That shared understanding forged a bond across the stars, turning a moment of kindness into a catalyst for an unimaginable future. Well, that worked out.